The breaking of the world, the 300-year madness of men. Good evening, and welcome back to Sleep to Lore. In this series, we journey through the grand histories and forgotten tales of vast fictional worlds, allowing their epic scale to guide us toward rest. Tonight, our story takes us to the cataclysmic end of a golden era, a time of unimaginable power and unparalleled tragedy in the world of the Wheel of Time. We will explore the tragic and terrifying period known as the breaking of the world, a 300-year-long age of madness that reshaped a planet and shattered a civilization, leaving scars that would last for millennia. This is the story of how the world's greatest saviors became its most horrific destroyers. If you enjoy these deep dives into history and legend and find them a calming way to end your day, please consider subscribing to the channel or leaving a comment. It helps the channel immensely and allows us to continue exploring these stories together. Before we begin, I have a question for you to consider. Do you believe the Dark One's counterstroke, the tainting of the source, was a calculated act of revenge or an unforeseen consequence of its prison being sealed? There is no right or wrong answer, but I would be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And now, settle in. Close your eyes if you wish. Let us journey back to the final moments of the Age of Legends, to a victory that would cost the world everything. Chapter 1. The Sour Victory. The air itself felt wounded. At the place called Shayol Ghul, the world was a raw, open sore. The sky was not a colour known to nature. It was a bruised purple and a sickly green, churning slowly like poisoned milk. The ground was not stone or soil, but a compacted grit of ancient despair, and the very laws of reality seemed thin here, stretched to their breaking point over a great and terrible nothingness. This was the threshold of the Dark One's prison, the focal point of a century of war, a conflict so vast and devastating it was known simply as the War of the Shadow. Here, the fate of all existence was being decided. At the centre of this maelstrom stood Lews Therin Telamon, the dragon. He was a tall man, though the weight of the world had stooped his shoulders. His dark eyes held the weariness of 1,000 lifetimes. Each one lived in the crucible of this war. Around him stood the 100 companions, the most powerful and trusted of his male Aes Sedai. They were generals, scholars, artists, and healers, the greatest men of a golden age, now reduced to the singular purpose of soldiers. Their fine robes were stained with sweat and dust, their faces grim masks of concentration. Each man was a living conduit for the one power, the fundamental force of creation, and together they represented a concentration of power not seen since the world was first spun into being. For 100 years they had fought. They had seen wonders and horrors that would shatter the minds of lesser men. They had watched cities of crystal and light burn under the unnatural fires of the shadow. They had fought Trollocs, monstrous amalgamations of human and animal, and their eyeless, soul-sucking commanders, the Myrddraal. They had duelled with the Forsaken, the Dark One's most powerful disciples, former Aes Sedai who had traded their souls for power and immortality. The war had cost them everything: their families, their homes, their peace. The world was bleeding, and this was their last, desperate gamble to cauterize the wound. Lews! Therin raised his hands, and the air hummed with power. From him, and from the 100 men who stood with him, flowed the male half of the true source, the river of power known as Sidon. It was a raging, untamable torrent, a flood of raw energy that took immense strength and willpower to master. The feeling of it was exhilarating, a feeling of life itself, magnified 1,000,000 times. They drew upon it, deeper and deeper, their bodies glowing with a soft silver light in the oppressive gloom of Shayol Ghul. Together they wove. They were not weaving thread, but the very fabric of reality. The flows of Sidon were intricate, a tapestry of immense complexity designed for a single purpose: to patch the hole in the Dark One's prison. This bore, as it was called, was a metaphysical wound drilled into the pattern by their own predecessors in a thirst for knowledge. an opening that allowed the Dark One's corrupting influence to touch the world. Now, Lews Therin and his companions were creating the seals, 7 focus points of immense power that would plug that hole forever. The strain was unimaginable. The Dark One pushed back, its formless, mindless evil pressing against their minds, whispering promises of power and despair. The men held firm, their wills a united shield against the abyss. They could feel the pattern resisting, groaning under the stress of such a massive alteration. They poured more of the one power into the weave, feeling their own bodies begin to fail under the strain. This was a task that should have taken the combined might of both male and female Aes Sedai, but Lews Therin had brought only men. It was a strategic choice born of a desperate need for secrecy and speed, a choice that would soon prove to be the most catastrophic in the history of the world. And then, with a final, desperate push, it was done. There was no sound, no explosion. Instead, there was a profound and sudden stillness. The pressure that had been building for a century vanished in an instant. The sickly light in the sky faded, replaced by the pale grey of a storm-scoured dawn. The wrongness of the place receded, the oppressive evil pulling back like a defeated tide. The bore was sealed. The prison was whole. For a long moment, the 100 companions simply stood, swaying on their feet, the silver glow around them fading. The silence was deafening. Some men fell to their knees, weeping with a relief so profound it was painful. Others stared blankly at their hands, unable to comprehend that the fight was over. Lews Therin himself stood frozen, the vast emptiness left by the struggle echoing in his soul. They had won. The war was over. The light had triumphed. A wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed over them, the first clean emotion they had felt in decades. They had saved the world. They were heroes. But the Dark One, in its final moment of contact, had lashed out. It was not a physical blow, not a blast of energy that could be shielded against. It was something far more insidious, a counterstroke of perfect divine spite. As the patch was woven, as the last threads of power snapped into place, the Dark One released its own corruption, its own filth, and aimed it not at the world, but at the very tool of its defeat. It threw the entirety of its malevolent essence at the river of power the men were touching, at Sedin itself. It was a stain, an invisible, metaphysical poison that instantly and irrevocably permeated the entire male half of the one power. The moment of victory lasted only a breath. Exhausted but triumphant, one of the companions reached for Sedin again, perhaps to weave a simple ward against the lingering chill of the place, or to open a gateway to travel home and announce their victory. He touched the source, and he screamed. It was a short, strangled sound of pure agony. Lews Therin, startled, reached for it himself. He had touched Sidon his entire life. It was a part of him, an exhilarating, clean rush of life and power. But now, as he opened himself to it, something was horribly wrong. The initial torrent was still there, the familiar power, but it was coated in something else. It was a greasy, vile slick, an oily film of utter corruption. It felt like trying to drink from a pure mountain spring, only to find the water thick with sewage. The power was still there, but to touch it, one had to wade through a river of filth. It was filled with hate, with rage, with paranoia, with a deep, gnawing despair that clawed at the mind. It felt slick, putrid, and alive with a malevolent intelligence. He recoiled, letting go of the source as if he had touched a hot coal. His heart hammered in his chest. Around him, the other men were having the same reaction. Cries of confusion and horror replaced the earlier tears of relief. They looked at each other, their eyes wide with a new kind of fear. What was this? What had happened? The source was their life, their tool, their gift, and now it was defiled. It was tainted. The desire to let it go, to never touch that foulness again, was overwhelming. But for a channeler, the one power is more than a tool, it is an addiction. To live without it after having touched it is a slow death, a fading into grey nothingness. They had to touch it, and so, hesitantly, fearfully, they reached for it again. And every time they did, the filth washed over them, seeping into their minds, their souls, a drop of black ink spreading through a vessel of clear water. The counterstroke was complete. The seeds of madness had been sown. The victory was utterly, totally, and irrevocably sour. The journey home from Shayol Ghul was a quiet, unnerving affair. The gateways they created, once clean arches of light, now seemed to shimmer with a sickly hue. The men spoke little, each lost in his own private horror. They tried to explain the sensation to their female counterparts, the women of the Aes Sedai, but words failed them. How do you describe the corruption of a concept? How do you explain that your very soul feels dirty? The women, who touched the pure, unsullied female half of the source, Saidar, could not understand. They felt nothing wrong. The world was safe. The war was won. They saw the men's distress and attributed it to the unimaginable horrors of the final battle, a deep and scarring trauma that would surely fade with time and healing. But this was not a wound that could be healed. It was not a trauma of the mind, but a poison of the soul. In the days that followed the great victory, the world celebrated. Parades were held in the magnificent crystalline cities of the Age of Legends. In Paran-Disen, in Comel, in Marwa, songs were sung in praise of the dragon and his 100 companions. The men were hailed as saviors, but they did not participate in the celebrations. They secluded themselves, trying to understand the sickness that now infected their power. The first signs were small, easily dismissed. They began as whispers in the back of the mind. An architect, one of the companions named Ayan, was in his study, designing a new civic centre, a building meant to be a monument to the newfound peace. For his entire life, his creations had been praised for their perfect harmony, their graceful, flowing lines that seemed to grow from the earth itself. He reached for a small flow of Sidon to help manipulate a holographic model, a common practice. As the tainted power flowed through him, the voices began. They whispered that his designs were weak, that harmony was a lie. They told him that true strength was in jagged edges, in jarring angles, in structures that dominated the sky rather than communing with it. He tried to ignore them, shaking his head to clear it. But the taint amplified his own insecurities, his own ambition. He started to alter the design. The gentle curves became sharp, threatening spires. The open plazas became oppressive, enclosed courtyards. His assistants watched in confusion. They suggested he rest, that the war had taken its toll. He looked at them, and for a fleeting moment, he did not see loyal colleagues. He saw rivals. He saw enemies who wanted to steal his glory. The paranoia, a key ingredient of the taint's poison, was taking root. He snarled at them to leave, his eyes holding a feverish glint they had never seen before. He turned back to his model, his hands now working frantically, twisting the beautiful structure into a nightmarish fortress. Elsewhere, another of the companions, a renowned healer named Rurik, was making his rounds in a hospital. He was known for his gentle hands and his calming presence. He moved to the bedside of a young woman recovering from an injury sustained in the war. He reached for Sidin, intending to weave the delicate flows of spirit and water to finish mending her broken bones. As the power filled him, the filth came with it, and with the filth came the visions. The young woman's face in the bed flickered. For a terrifying second, he saw not a human, but a Trolloc, its bestial snout wrinkled in a snarl. He flinched back, dropping his connection to the source. He blinked, and she was a woman again, looking at him with concern. He forced a smile, blaming his reaction on exhaustion. But the image was burned into his mind. He moved to the next patient, an old man, and saw the eyeless face of a Murdral staring back at him. Panic began to set in. He looked around the ward, and every patient, every colleague, their faces flickered with the visages of the enemy. The taint was twisting his perceptions, turning his world into a waking nightmare where the shadow was everywhere, hiding behind every friendly face. He fled the hospital, his mind reeling. The man who had saved thousands of lives was now terrified of his own patients. The madness took different forms for different men. For some, it was paranoia, a deep and unshakable belief that they were surrounded by dark friends. For others, it was delusion, terrifying hallucinations that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. For many, it was a profound melancholia, a soul-deep despair that whispered to them of the futility of existence, an endless grey sadness that no joy could penetrate. The female Aes Sedai grew increasingly concerned. Their attempts to heal the men were met with failure. They would weave the flows of the One Power, the pure streams of Saidar, to soothe the mind and mend the spirit, but it was like trying to use water to put out an oil fire. The healing had no effect, or worse, it seemed to agitate the men, as if the purity of Saidar was an irritant to the filth of the taint. They held councils in the great hall of the servants, their discussions growing more frantic. Theories were proposed. A new kind of weapon used by the shadow in the final moments. A psychic backlash from the ceiling of the bore. A collective psychological breakdown on an unprecedented scale. They could not grasp the truth, because the truth was unthinkable. They could not conceive that the very essence of Saidin, half of the force that drove creation, had been corrupted. It would be like trying to imagine the sky itself had turned to poison, or that the very act of breathing had become a fatal flaw. The isolated incidents began to grow more frequent and more violent. A celebrated general, giving a speech to his victorious armies, suddenly stopped mid-sentence. He stared out at his most loyal commanders, men who had fought by his side for decades, and his expression twisted into a mask of rage. He began screaming accusations, pointing at them and calling them traitors, Shadowspawn masquerading as men. His words, channeled with a hint of the One Power, boomed across the parade ground, turning a celebration into a scene of horrified confusion. In a quiet suburban home, a man who had been a loving husband and father for 200 years came home from his work. He kissed his wife, played with his children, and sat down for the evening meal. In the middle of dinner, he looked at his family, and the madness, which had been a quiet whisper until now, became a deafening roar. The taint convinced him, with absolute certainty, that his family had been replaced by duplicates, by cunning creatures sent by the shadow to destroy him. He rose from the table, his eyes burning with insane purpose. His wife saw the look on his face and screamed for her children to run. That night, a hero of the war destroyed his own family in a fit of delusion, convinced he was defending himself from the forces of darkness. These were personal tragedies, small pockets of horror in a world that was still trying to celebrate its salvation. They were explained away as isolated breakdowns, the terrible price of a long and brutal war. But they were not isolated. They were the first tremors of an earthquake that would bring the entire world crashing down. The whispers of madness were growing louder, coalescing into a symphony of insanity that was about to reach its crescendo. The tipping point, the moment the world could no longer deny the horror, came in the city of Maruwa. It was a city known for its music and its vast floating parks, gardens suspended in the air by weaves of the One Power. It was a place of profound peace and beauty, and it was the home of one of the most powerful of the 100 companions, a man named Derek. Derek had been a gentle soul, a musician whose compositions were said to be able to bring tears to the eyes of the most hardened warrior. But the taint had worked on him differently. It did not bring him paranoia or rage, but a deep, all-consuming despair. The whispers in his mind told him that beauty was a lie, that peace was an illusion, and that all creation was a flawed, ugly thing that deserved only to be unmade. The music in his soul had been replaced by a discordant shriek. One afternoon, he walked to the center of one of the city's largest floating parks. The people there smiled and greeted him, the hero Derek. He did not see them. He saw only the flaws in creation, the ugliness he now perceived in every flower, every child's laugh, every beautiful building. He believed, with the utter conviction of the insane, that he was performing a mercy. He reached for Sidon, and this time he did not flinch from the filth. He embraced it. He drew more and more of the corrupted power into himself, letting the rage and despair of the Dark One become his own. The sky above Marua began to darken. The people in the park looked up, confused. A storm was gathering with unnatural speed. Derek raised his hands, and the city began to die. The destruction was not swift. It was methodical, artistic in its cruelty. He started with his own element, sound. He wove the one power into a wave of pure, dissonant noise, a chord of such profound wrongness that it shattered every pane of glass in the city simultaneously. The beautiful music of Marua was replaced by a single, agonizing scream of tormented physics. Then he turned to the floating parks. The delicate weaves holding them aloft were torn apart. The massive islands of earth and plants and trees, monuments to the grace of the age of legends, simply fell from the sky. They crashed into the city below, crushing entire districts under tons of soil and rock. Buildings of delicate glass and elegant metal, which had stood for 1,000 years, were obliterated in an instant. He was not done. He began to pull the very earth apart. The ground split open, swallowing streets and plazas. He drew fire from the sky, not clean lightning, but oily black flames that clung to everything they touched and could not be extinguished by water. He unraveled the flows of air, creating tornadoes that tore through the city, reducing its elegant spires to rubble. The people of Marua had no defense. This was not an army they could fight. This was a god, one of their own saviors, gone mad and turning his divine power against them. The female Aes Sedai in the city tried to stop him, to shield the people, but their strength was a candle against a hurricane. Derek, swollen with the taint and a power far beyond their own, brushed their shields aside as if they were cobwebs. For hours, he continued his work of destruction, his face a blank mask of concentration, as if he were composing his final, terrible symphony. When he was finished, Marua was gone. Where a vibrant city had stood, there was now only a smoking crater, a testament to the madness of a single man. The news of its destruction and the identity of its destroyer spread across the globe like a shockwave. The denial was shattered. The excuses ran out. This was not battle fatigue. This was not a collection of isolated incidents. This was a plague. A sickness of the mind and soul that was consuming the most powerful men in the world. The 100 companions, the heroes who had sealed the boar, the saviors of humanity, were now the world's greatest threat. Their victory had been a lie, a trick of the light that had hidden the true cost. The war was not over. A new, far more terrifying war was just beginning. It would not be a war against the shadow, but a war against sanity itself. The breaking of the world had begun. Chapter 2. The Earth's Fever. The destruction of Marua was not an end. It was a declaration. It was the moment the world stopped looking for cures and started looking for shelter. The localized tragedies, the personal descents into madness, had now coalesced into a global, continuous cataclysm. The shock had passed, replaced by a permanent state of dread. This was not a war with battle lines and objectives. It was a planetary seizure with humanity as the helpless passenger. The auras of the 100 companions and the thousands of other male Aes Sedai who had survived the war now blazed across the globe like funeral pyres. Each man was a god in his own right, and each was utterly, hopelessly insane. What followed was not a breaking, but a complete geological and meteorological unraveling. The world was plunged into a fever, and its own immune system, the most powerful men of the age, had become the disease. The planet began to tear itself apart. The great central continent, a single vast landmass, was the first to feel the full fury. In the northern plains, in a region of rolling green hills and placid rivers that had been the breadbasket for a dozen cities, the ground began to tremble. It was not the familiar, violent shaking of an earthquake, but a deep, resonant shudder that went on for days, a groan from the very bones of the world. The people in the towns and farming communities grew uneasy. The tremors were not strong enough to topple buildings, but they were constant, a vibration felt in the soles of the feet and the pit of the stomach. Livestock grew panicked, birds took to the sky and did not return. The rivers began to run cloudy with silt. Then the ground began to rise. It was an impossible sight, something so contrary to the laws of nature that the mind struggled to accept it. Along a line stretching for thousands of miles, the gentle plains began to swell upwards. It was not a sudden, violent thrust, but a slow, inexorable buckling, like a great muscle tensing beneath the skin of the earth. In a town called Aparel, the people watched as the fields to the east tilted, the horizon itself seeming to climb into the sky. The sound began then, a grinding, tearing roar that would never cease, day or night, for the next 50 years. It was the sound of bedrock, miles thick, being fractured and forced upwards. The man responsible was named Gorin. He had been a geologist in the Age of Legends, a man who loved the deep, slow processes of the earth. His madness had twisted that love into a terrible impatience. He wanted to feel the power of millennia in a single moment. He wandered along the fault line he had chosen, his hands outstretched, pouring a constant, unimaginable torrent of tainted sedin into the crust. He was building a wall. In his broken mind, he believed he was raising a great barrier to protect the world from a non-existent threat coming from the east. He was a creator, a shaper, a protector. For the people in his path, he was the apocalypse. The land rose higher and higher. What had been a gentle slope became a steep hill, then a cliff, then a mountain. Entire towns were lifted into the sky, their structures groaning and collapsing under the impossible strain. Rivers were severed, their courses dammed by the rising earth, and they began to form vast lakes in the lowlands, drowning cities that had been hundreds of miles from any major body of water. The sound of tearing rock was joined by the constant roar of landslides as the new, unstable mountainsides gave way. The sky filled with a permanent haze of dust so thick that the sun became a dim, red smear, and a constant rain of fine grit fell on everything, choking the lungs and burying the world in a grey shroud. Day by day, the mountains grew. Peaks that had not existed a month before now towered miles into the sky, their summits wreathed in clouds of their own making. They were not like the old, worn mountains of the world. These were jagged, raw, and angry, with sheer cliffs and knife-edge ridges that had never known the softening touch of wind or rain. Volcanoes, stirred from their ancient slumber or created anew by the immense pressure, erupted all along the growing range, spewing lava and ash and adding to the hellish chaos. The spine of the world was being born, a jagged wound running down the length of the continent, a monument to the madness of a single man. The green plains were gone forever, replaced by an impassable barrier of stone and fire. Millions died, either crushed in the upheaval, drowned in the new lakes, or suffocated by the endless dust. And Gorin, the Earthshaker, walked through it all, oblivious to the destruction, lost in his grand, insane act of creation. While the land was being thrust upwards in the interior, it was collapsing into the sea along the coasts. The great coastal cities of the Age of Legends were marvels of engineering and beauty. Paradisen, the capital of the world, was a city of soaring towers and breathtaking bridges, a place where art and function were one. Its great harbours teemed with ships that sailed on the winds of the one power. Its people lived in a state of grace and peace. It was here that the madness of another of the 100 companions, a man named TWOT, found its expression. TWOT had been an admiral, a lover of the sea, its vastness and its power. The taint had turned that love into a jealous obsession. The land in his mind was an impurity, a stain on the perfect blue of the ocean. He decided to wash it clean. He stood on the highest sea cliff overlooking the Arith Ocean and began to pull. He did not pull the water towards the land. He pulled the land down into the water. The continental shelf, the bedrock upon which the entire coastal region rested, began to groan and fracture under the strain. The first sign for the people of Parandisan and the surrounding cities was the sea itself pulling back. The water in the harbours vanished, receding for miles, exposing the seabed in a silent, ominous spectacle. Strange sea creatures flopped in the mud, and the great ships that had been moored in the deep harbours were left listing on their sides. The wise knew this was a prelude to a tsunami, but no one could have imagined the scale of what was to come. The wave that returned was not a wave. It was a moving mountain range of water, hundreds of feet high, that blotted out the horizon. It did not break upon the shore. It simply consumed it. It swept over the city of Parandisan, the immense force of the water snapping the bases of the crystalline towers and carrying them away like twigs. The beautiful bridges shattered. The parks and plazas and universities were scoured from the face of the earth in a single, roaring moment. But this was not a simple tsunami. As the water crashed inland, the land itself gave way. Tate's relentless pulling caused the entire coastline to buckle and sink. The ground shook with earthquakes of a magnitude never before recorded. Great fissures opened up, swallowing whole districts. The sea did not recede. It stayed, claiming the sunken land as its new domain. What had been a vibrant, populated coastline became a churning, violent sea filled with the debris of a civilization. The destruction radiated outwards. A vast, low-lying plain to the south of Parandisan was completely inundated, creating a new body of water that would one day be called the Sea of Storms. The sinking of the land triggered sympathetic collapses for thousands of miles. Entire peninsulas broke away from the mainland, forming massive islands. Mountain ranges that had once been deep inland became coastal cliffs, their eastern faces sheared away as if by a giant blade. The world map was being violently and irrevocably redrawn. The Arith Ocean had advanced, and where the heart of a global civilization had once stood, there was now only the endless roiling water. Tate the sailor stood on his crumbling cliff, laughing into the wind, as the ocean he worshipped claimed its prize. Not all the mad channelers were so grand in their destruction. Some were more intimate, more focused in their insanity. One, whose name is lost to history, developed a terrifying obsession with emptiness. He had been a philosopher, a man who sought stillness and quiet contemplation. The taint twisted his philosophy into a nihilistic creed that all life, all moisture, all vibrancy was a noisy distraction from the purity of nothingness. He began to walk eastward across the vast, fertile grasslands that bordered the spine of the world. As he walked, he drew the one power, and with it, he drew the life from the world around him. He pulled the moisture from the soil, the water from the rivers, the sap from the trees, and the very air itself. The process was horrifyingly fast. A lush forest in his path would wither and die in minutes, the leaves crumbling to dust, the wood becoming dry and brittle. Rivers and streams hissed into steam and vanished, leaving behind cracked, muddy beds that baked into hard clay under the sun. The rich topsoil turned to pale sand. The green grasslands became a sea of dunes. He was a walking vortex of desiccation. Animals that could not flee in time simply collapsed, their bodies mummifying where they fell. He walked for decades, a slow, relentless plague upon the land. Behind him, he left a desert, a vast expanse of sand and rock that would come to be known as the Waste. It was a land utterly scoured of life, where the sun beat down without mercy and the wind blew nothing but sand. He did not touch the people. He simply took away the world that sustained them. They were forced to flee before his path of destruction, abandoning their homes and their histories, becoming nomads in a world that was rapidly running out of places to go. His madness was a quiet one, a creeping death that was just as absolute as the fire and the flood. While the very ground was betraying humanity, the sky became a canvas for the madmen's rage. The intricate systems of the One Power that the Aes Sedai of the Age of Legends used to maintain a perfect, stable climate were shattered. Now, individual channelers seized control of the weather for their own insane purposes. In the newly formed Sea of Storms, a group of madmen, perhaps imagining themselves as gods of the tempest, created a permanent hurricane. It was a storm of impossible size, hundreds of miles across, that never dissipated. For 200 years it raged, its winds tearing at the new coastlines, its rains causing endless floods. To be a sailor in that age was to be a gambler with no hope of winning. Elsewhere, the sky rained fire. A channeler who was tormented by visions of burning began to replicate his nightmares in reality. He would conjure vast clouds, but instead of water, they would be filled with superheated air and particles of flaming dust. The rains that fell from them were not life-giving. They were curtains of fire that incinerated everything they touched. Entire regions were turned into blackened, smouldering wastelands under these perpetual firestorms. In the north, another channeler, lost in a deep, melancholic despair, wanted the world to feel the coldness that had consumed his soul. He pulled a blanket of winter over the land that would last for a century. He created blizzards in the middle of summer, buried tropical forests under dozens of feet of snow, and froze great rivers solid. The sun was a distant, useless coin in a perpetually grey sky. The world grew cold, and the survivors huddled together for warmth, their lives reduced to a constant struggle against the freezing air and the ever-present snow. The cumulative effect of the volcanoes, the firestorms, and the dust from the rising mountains was a slow and terrifying choking of the sun. For long periods, sometimes lasting decades, the sky across the entire planet was a dark, oppressive ceiling of brown and grey. Sunlight could not penetrate the thick haze. A perpetual twilight fell upon the world. This was a disaster that affected everyone, everywhere. Crops failed on a global scale. The intricate food production systems of the Age of Legends had been destroyed, and now even subsistence farming became impossible. Widespread famine followed. Humanity, already reeling from the direct destruction, was now starving. Life in this new world was a waking nightmare. Civilization, as a concept, ceased to exist. The great cities were either destroyed or abandoned. The global network of communication, which used Terangriel to allow instantaneous conversation across any distance, fell silent. The knowledge of how to create or maintain the wonders of the age was lost as the universities burned and the scholars were scattered or killed. History itself began to dissolve. For those born into the breaking, the Age of Legends was not a memory. It was a half-believed myth, a story told by terrified old people about a paradise world that was impossible to imagine. The daily reality for the common person was a grim struggle for survival. You did not trust the ground beneath your feet, for it might split open or rise up to crush you. You did not trust the sky above your head, for it might rain fire or drop a tornado on your home. You did not trust the stranger on the road, for they might be a desperate bandit, or worse, they might be one of the madmen, a quiet figure who could unmake your entire world with a gesture. People were scattered into small, isolated groups, hiding in caves, in the ruins of their former cities, or in deep forests. They became tribal, suspicious, and violent. The grace and learning of the previous age were burned away, leaving only the hard, sharp core of survival. In the midst of this universal chaos, there were places of refuge. They were called steading. They were the homes of the Ogier, a non-human race of builders and gardeners who were ancient even in the Age of Legends. The steading were areas where the One Power simply did not exist. A channeler who entered a steading was cut off from the true source, unable to touch the life-giving river of power. For the insane male Aes Sedai, this meant the whispers in their minds fell silent. The rage and paranoia receded. But to be cut off from the source was also terrifying, and most of them instinctively avoided the steading, feeling their unnatural emptiness from miles away. For human refugees, however, the steading were paradise. A group of survivors might spend months traveling through a broken and terrifying landscape, hounded by storms and earthquakes, starving and desperate. Their guide might be one of the female Aes Sedai, using her own pure power to shield them, to find them food and water, her face a grim mask of exhaustion and sorrow. The journey would be one of constant fear. Then they would cross an unseen boundary, and everything would change. The roaring wind would fall to a gentle breeze. The constant low-level trembling of the earth would cease. The air would suddenly feel clean and calm. This was the edge of a steading. Inside, the ancient trees, lovingly tended by the Ogier for millennia, seemed to hum with a deep, quiet life of their own. The light was softer, the sounds of nature clear and pure. There was a profound and absolute peace, a stillness that was more than just the absence of noise. It was a safety that soaked into the bones. Here, the mad gods could not touch them. The earth would not betray them, and the sky would not fall. The Ogier, gentle giants with broad faces and long tufted ears, would welcome the refugees with a deep and mournful sadness. They grieved for the breaking of the world, which they called the Great Uprooting. Their steading were not infinite, and they could not save everyone, but they offered what sanctuary they could. The steading became legendary, beacons of hope in a world consumed by darkness. The stories of these safe havens spread among the survivors, often becoming the goal of desperate, multi-generational journeys. To reach a steading was to survive. The female Aes Sedai became the shepherds of this broken world. Their grand organization, the Hall of the Servants, was a memory. They were scattered, isolated, their numbers vastly reduced. Their purpose had been stripped down to its most essential form: protect the innocent. They no longer created great wonders or governed nations. They led small bands of refugees, their lives a constant struggle against the chaos wrought by their own brothers, husbands, and friends. A female Aes Sedai might spend her days using weaves of air to create a shield against an acid rain, or weaves of water to purify a contaminated stream. She would use spirit and fire to heal the sick and injured, her strength a flickering candle against an ocean of suffering. And sometimes she would have to fight. She would see a lone male figure on a hilltop, gathering power to unleash some new horror, and she would have to make a terrible choice. She would have to stand against him, her pure Saidar against his tainted, rage-fueled Saidin. These battles were desperate, terrifying affairs. She was almost always outmatched in terms of raw power, for the most powerful channelers had been men. She had to rely on her wits, her skill, and the grim knowledge that if she failed, everyone behind her would die. This was their new reality. They were the world's only defense against its former saviors. A deep, sorrowful hardening began within their sisterhood. The open, collaborative nature of their order was replaced by a grim, secretive determination. They were forced to hunt the men they once loved, not with the hope of healing them, for that had proven impossible, but with the intent to sever them from the one power, a brutal process called gentling, or, if there was no other choice, to kill them. It was a horrific duty, and it stained their souls, but it was necessary. They were the thin, resilient line holding back the complete annihilation of the human race. The Earth's fever raged on. This was the peak of the cataclysm, the age of grand destruction, where the shape of the world was forged anew in fire and flood and tearing stone. The old world was dead and buried. Its wonders were ruins. Its history was forgotten. Its people were scattered and broken. Humanity had been thrown back into a primitive darkness, armed with only the fading memories of a better time. The number of the madmen was still great, and their power was absolute. The breaking was not even halfway through its long 300-year course. The fever had reached its peak, but it had not yet broken. The long, slow decline, the age of scars and silence, was yet to come. Chapter 3. the scars of generations. The initial fury of the breaking, the grand world-shaping paroxysms of power, had begun to subside, not because the madness had lessened, but because the sources of that madness were, one by one, being extinguished. 100 years had passed, then 150. The Earth's fever had not broken, but the seizures were becoming less frequent, less planet-shatteringly violent. The number of male Aes Sedai from the Age of Legends was dwindling. They died of old age, though their lives were long. They died in foolish accidents, their minds too consumed by delusion to notice a cliff's edge. They died at the hands of their own destructive power, drawing too much of the tainted source and burning themselves out like overstrained engines. And they were hunted. The world had settled into a new and terrible rhythm, a normalcy of chaos that would last for generations. For the people born into this age, the world of soaring crystal cities and flying vehicles was not even a memory. It was a preposterous fairy tale, a myth as distant and unbelievable as the creation of the world itself. Their world was one of ruins, dust, and fear. Imagine a child born in the 170th year of the breaking. Let us call her Elia. Elia's world is a small one. It consists of the interconnected caves her people inhabit, and the stretch of scorched valley they can see from the cave mouth. The sky above is often a sickly brown, a permanent haze of dust that turns the midday sun into a weak, orange disk. Sometimes the ground trembles, a low, persistent shudder that makes the pebbles on the cave floor dance. No one panics when this happens. It is simply the way things are. The elders call it the world's Ag. For Elia, a stable, unmoving earth is as fantastical a concept as a world without hunger. Her people are scavengers. They live in the shattered shell of what was once a transportation hub. Great metal machines, which the elders call show wings in their garbled memory of the old tongue, lie rusted and broken in the valley, their elegant lines and smooth surfaces pitted and torn. The children play in their hollowed-out fuselages, their laughter echoing in chambers that once carried people across continents in minutes. Elia and her friends do not know this. To them, these are just strange, metal caves, good for sheltering from the rains that are sometimes black and oily and sting the skin. Their lives are governed by superstition and fear. The greatest fear is of the Wanderers, the name they have given to the few remaining male channelers. They are no longer seen as men. They are forces of nature, bogeymen, walking disasters with names born of terror and folklore. They are spoken of in hushed whispers around the sputtering fires at night, their stories serving as both cautionary tales and the community's only form of history. One of the Wanderers they fear is a being they call the Ground Twister. The elders say he never sleeps in the same place twice, that he walks a slow, circular path across the land that takes 10 years to complete. They know he is near when the Earth's ache becomes more violent and a low humming sound can be felt in the bones. The Ground Twister does not use fire or flood. In his madness, he is obsessed with patterns. He walks, and the land in his wake is twisted into impossible shapes. Plains are contorted into mazes of deep, narrow canyons. Forests are pulled into concentric circles. Rivers are forced to flow uphill in defiance of gravity, creating stagnant, stinking waterfalls. His passing does not necessarily kill, but it leaves the land impassable, a permanent scar that cuts communities off from whatever meager resources they might have relied on. Elia's people have a team of dedicated watchers, posted on the highest ridge, whose only job is to listen for the hum, and watch for the telltale shimmer in the air that signals his approach. If he is spotted, the entire community must pack their few belongings and flee, for there is no fighting the Ground Twister. You can only hope to be out of his path when he decides to reshape your world. Another figure of dread is the Lord of Sorrows. This wanderer does not travel. He found a place, a wide river valley generations ago, and simply stopped. His madness is one of deep, inconsolable grief. He sits on a black, glassy throne of his own making, and he weeps for a loss his broken mind can no longer name. his sorrow manifests as water. He draws it from the air, from the ground, from the sky. For a 200-mile radius around his throne, it rains. It never stops. It is a constant, miserable drizzle that has turned a once fertile valley into a vast, sucking swamp. The old ruins in this land, the bones of cities and towns, are covered in green slime and half submerged in stagnant water. The trees are perpetually weeping, their branches heavy with moss. Strange pale fish swim through what were once city plazas. The people who live on the edges of the Lord of Sorrow's domain, the Maya folk, are gaunt, pale-skinned, and afflicted with a deep melancholy that they believe comes from breathing his air. They tell stories of travelers who wander too deep into the mire and are claimed by the sorrow, their bodies found floating, their faces peaceful, as if they welcomed the release of drowning. The Lord of Sorrows is a passive destroyer, a god of despair whose very presence poisons the world with sadness. This is the new mythology of the world. The science and rationalism of the Age of Legends have been utterly replaced by a primitive animism, where every strange weather pattern, every tremor of the earth, is attributed to the whim of a vengeful, unseen power. The people have forgotten that these powers are men. To them, it is simply the nature of their broken world. The sun is a fickle god, the earth is an angry beast, and the wanderers are its cruel masters. Society itself has devolved. The global community of the previous age has shattered into a million tiny, isolated fragments. Trust is a resource more precious and scarcer than clean water. Elia's community might encounter another group of survivors once every few years. These encounters are tense, terrifying affairs, usually conducted at a distance with spears and arrows held at the ready. Trade is rare and fraught with peril. A stranger is not a potential friend, but a potential threat, a rival for the scarce food and shelter. Language has begun to fracture. The elegant, universal tongue of the Age of Legends is now spoken only by the very old, and even they barely remember it. New dialects, harsh and simple, have sprung up in every isolated pocket of humanity, creating yet another barrier between communities. The social structure is simple and brutal. The strongest rule. Warlords, men, and sometimes women who are bigger, more ruthless, or more clever than those around them, carve out small fiefdoms for themselves. They might control a cave system with a pure spring, a patch of land where edible tubers still grow, or the ruins of an old armory with a handful of still functional weapons from the War of the Shadow. Life under such a ruler is one of harsh servitude, but it is often preferable to the alternative of facing the broken world alone. The concepts of justice, law, and human rights are luxuries that no one can afford. Survival is the only morality. Amidst this decay, the loss of knowledge was perhaps the greatest tragedy. It was a slow, creeping intellectual death that happened in parallel with the physical destruction of the world. The treasures of the Age of Legends were not just its wondrous devices, but the accumulated wisdom of millennia. This wisdom was stored in great libraries, universities, and data archives. And these places, being centers of population and power, were often the first to be destroyed. The greatest of these was the Column, the central university in Parandisan. Before the city was drowned, the Column was the intellectual heart of the world. It was not a single building, but a sprawling campus of white towers and open, airy courtyards. It did not hold books made of paper. Knowledge was stored in small, glowing crystal lattices, each one capable of holding the contents of 1,000,000 books. A student could pick up a crystal, place it in a reader, and have the knowledge within flow directly into their mind. Or they could explore it in a 3-dimensional, interactive hologram. The Column held everything: the complete history of their civilization, the intricacies of their science, every poem ever written, every symphony ever composed, every philosophical treatise ever debated. It was the sum total of human genius. Its destruction was not an accident of the larger cataclysm. It was a deliberate act of insanity. One of the 100 companions, a man named Valen, had been a law master at the university. He was a man who loved knowledge above all else. The taint corrupted this love into a horrifying obsession. The whispers of the taint convinced him that the knowledge itself was the source of the world's pain. It was the thirst for knowledge that led to the drilling of the bore. It was knowledge that created the weapons of the war. In his madness, he came to believe that true peace could only be achieved through absolute ignorance. He saw himself as a savior, a purifier who would free humanity from the burden of thought. He returned to the Column Dan, the place he had loved most in the world. He walked its serene hallways, his face a mask of terrible purpose. The few scholars and students who remained tried to greet him, their former colleague and a hero of the war. He did not speak to them. He walked to the central archive, the heart of the university, a vast spherical chamber where the master copies of all the knowledge crystals were stored, floating in a complex, shimmering array. Then he began his work. He did not use fire. That would have been too crude. Instead, he wove the one power to create a resonance, a specific frequency of vibration that was harmless to stone and metal, but fatal to the delicate crystalline structures of the archives. A low hum filled the great chamber, and one by one, the glowing crystals began to crack. A web of fine fractures would appear on their smooth surfaces, and then they would shatter, dissolving into a cloud of useless, glittering dust. A sound like the tinkling of a billion tiny bells filled the air as millennia of knowledge ceased to exist. The history of nations, the cure for every disease, the secrets of creating the terrain greal, the poetry of lost ages, the elegant mathematics that described the turning of the pattern itself, all of it was unwritten, erased from existence in a cascade of shimmering dust. The scholars who tried to stop him were met with a wall of invisible force. They could only watch weeping as their life's work, their world's entire heritage, was annihilated. When Valen was finished, the central archive was filled with a knee-deep layer of fine, sparkling sand. He had not destroyed a library, he had lobotomized a civilization. This act was repeated in lesser forms all over the world, as other mad channelers, in their various delusions, turned on the seats of learning they had once cherished. The loss was not just abstract, it had immediate, practical consequences that shaped the new, primitive reality. The concept of travel, for instance, was completely transformed. In the age of legends, a person could use a network of transport circles, or have an Aes Sedai create a gateway to travel from one side of the world to the other in a single step. The world was, in effect, small and interconnected. With the knowledge of how to create and maintain these systems lost, and with the few remaining channelers either mad or in hiding, humanity was returned to its most basic mode of transportation, walking. The world suddenly became vast and terrifyingly large. A journey to the next valley, where another group of survivors might live, could take weeks of perilous travel through a twisted and dangerous landscape. A journey to a different continent was unthinkable, a feat beyond the capabilities of anyone alive. The new mountain ranges, the vast swamps, the deserts, these were not just features on a map, they were absolute barriers. Humanity was penned into small, isolated pockets, with no knowledge of what lay beyond the next ridge. The world beyond their immediate sight became a blank space, a realm of monsters and myths. The loss of medicine was just as profound. The age of legends had conquered disease. Aes Sedai healers could mend bones, knit flesh, and purge the body of any ailment with weaves of the one power. Even for non-channelers, advanced medical technology existed that could regenerate organs and cure any sickness. Now that knowledge was gone. A simple cut could become infected and lead to a slow, agonizing death. A broken leg was a death sentence. Childbirth was once again a perilous, life-threatening event. The average lifespan, which had been several centuries, plummeted to 30 or 40 years. Humanity became a species once again plagued by sickness, infection, and the simple frailties of the flesh. The knowledge of herbs, and basic first aid became invaluable, and the women in a community who possessed such skills were revered as wise women, a pale and distant echo of the great healers of the past. The everyday wonders that people had taken for granted simply failed. The lights went out. The systems that provided clean water and disposed of waste in the cities ceased to function. The devices that could produce food from the air, the coolers that preserved it, the cleaners that washed clothes with sound, all fell silent. Survivors in the ruins of a city were surrounded by inert objects of incomprehensible purpose. They might use a piece of a fallen show wing as a roof for their hut, or a beautiful, inert terangrial as a doorstop, with no understanding of what these things once were. They were like ants crawling over the circuit board of a dead supercomputer, living amidst the artifacts of a godlike power they could no longer comprehend. The female Aes Sedai and the few non-channeling scholars who survived fought a desperate losing battle against this tide of ignorance. Their mission changed. In the early years of the breaking, their goal was to save people, to guide them to the safety of the steading. Now, as the generations passed, their goal shifted to saving knowledge. They became secret librarians, guardians of forbidden lore. A small group of them might establish a hidden refuge, a library in a cave or a fortified ruin, and dedicate their long lives to preserving the fragments of the old world they could find. They would gather the few surviving knowledge crystals, but with no readers, the information within was locked away. So they undertook the monumental task of trying to translate the contents, to transcribe the knowledge into a more primitive form, handwritten scrolls and books. It was a painfully slow and often hopeless task. They would try to teach the children of the survivors, to pass on the basics of reading, writing, and history. But it was difficult to teach philosophy to a child who was starving, or mathematics to a community that needed to learn how to flint-knap new spearheads. The immediate, brutal needs of survival always took precedence over the abstract value of knowledge. These guardians of knowledge became figures of suspicion. In a world where power was a terrifying and destructive force, anyone who possessed strange abilities or ancient knowledge was often feared and shunned. The female Aes Sedai had to operate in secret, hiding their abilities, their true purpose a secret kept by their dwindling sisterhood. They gathered what they could, knowing that most of it would be lost, but hoping that some small seed of the old world could be preserved, a seed that might one day, in a far distant future, be able to grow again. The middle period of the breaking was an age of grinding attrition. The spectacular destruction gave way to a slow, inexorable decay. The world was quieter now, not with peace, but with emptiness. The human population was a tiny fraction of what it had been. The great cities were silent tombs, their broken towers like gravestones for a dead civilization. The wanderers still roamed, but they were fewer now, old and weathered, their madness as ancient and ingrained as the mountains they had raised. The scars on the land had settled, no longer fresh wounds, but permanent features of the new geography. And the scars on the human soul, the loss of knowledge, culture, and grace, had become a permanent part of the human condition. The world had been broken, and now its memory was being erased. The final act, the long, slow fade into silence, was all that remained. Chapter 4. The Final Roar. 2 centuries had passed since the victory at Shayol Ghul, 200 years of fire and flood, of a world twisting in a fever dream. For a person of the age of legends, this was a long but conceivable span of time. For the new humanity, born into the wreckage, it was an eternity. It was the entirety of their known history. The breaking was not an event, it was the fundamental condition of existence. The world had always trembled. The sky had always been a threatening, unpredictable canvas. The wanderers had always been the gods and demons that haunted the land. But a change was occurring, a shift so slow and subtle that it could only be perceived by those with the longest memories, or the most carefully kept records. The chaos was waning. The great, earth-shattering cataclysms had almost ceased. No new mountain ranges were being thrust into the sky. No new oceans were being carved from the land. The remaining male Aes Sedai were a mere fraction of their former numbers. They were ancient now, their bodies stooped with an age no human was meant to bear, their minds so steeped in the taint that they were less men and more living embodiments of the Dark One's lingering spite. The loudest, most explosive manifestations of madness had largely burned themselves out. The men who summoned firestorms eventually immolated themselves. The men who moved mountains were eventually buried by them. The ones who remained were often those whose insanity was of a different, more durable nature. They were the architects of perpetual swamps, the weavers of endless blizzards, the silent walkers who twisted the minds of those they passed. They were the embers of the Great Fire, still capable of causing immense pain and destruction, but their power no longer threatened to unmake the world on a planetary scale. The planet itself was settling into its new, scarred form. The spine of the world stood immense and silent, its peaks now capped with the first snows of a natural winter. The sea of storms still raged, but the hurricane at its heart had weakened, its fury lessened. The waste was a permanent feature of the geography, a vast, dead sea of sand. Life had adapted to the new reality. Strange, hardy plants grew in the ash-choked soil. Mutated creatures, warped by the lingering energies of the One Power, roamed the shattered forests. And humanity, resilient and tenacious, clung to life in its caves and ruins, their numbers slowly, painstakingly beginning to recover. They were a feral, superstitious people, but they had survived. The long, slow dusk of the breaking had begun. This new phase was defined by a new kind of war. It was no longer a desperate, defensive struggle for survival against overwhelming chaos. It had become a proactive, deadly hunt. The remaining female Aes Sedai, who had once been scattered shepherds, had begun to organize. Over the course of 2 centuries, through secret communications and perilous journeys, they had re-established a loose network. They were no longer the benevolent guides of a lost age. They were a grim sisterhood of soldiers, hardened by generations of loss and brutal necessity. Their sole, unifying purpose was to find and neutralize every last remaining male channeler. The time for hiding was over. The time for hunting had begun. These women were not the Aes Sedai of the White Tower, not yet. That institution was still centuries in the future. They were a scattered, secretive order with no central leadership, bound only by their shared power and their common cause. They operated in small groups, sometimes alone, relying on a network of spies and informants among the common people. They developed a new set of skills, born of their harsh reality. They were masters of stealth and camouflage, able to move through the broken lands unseen. They were experts in tracking, able to read the subtle signs of a channeler's passage. A patch of ground where the vegetation was unnaturally withered, a stream whose water tasted of ozone, a village where the people suffered from a shared, specific delusion. They rarely worked alone. Over the generations, they had found allies among the bravest of ordinary men and women. These were the first of the people who would one day be called warders. They were warriors who swore their lives to the Aes Sedai and their cause. They were not naive. They knew they were fighting beings of godlike power. Their motivations were simple and profound. Some were driven by revenge, the last survivors of a family or a village destroyed by a wanderer. Others were driven by a fierce, protective love for their own communities, a desire to create some small pocket of safety in the world. Many came from families that had served the Aes Sedai for generations, a sacred duty passed from father to son, from mother to daughter. These companions were the Aes Sedai's eyes and ears, their sword and their shield. They could go into places where a woman who could channel would be instantly sensed. They gathered intelligence, laid traps, and when the time for confrontation came, they fought with a courage that bordered on madness. They used whatever weapons they could find or fashion. Simple spears with fire-hardened tips, bows strung with the gut of mutated beasts, and sometimes, if they were lucky, a rare, scavenged weapon from the Age of Legends, though they rarely knew how to use it properly. Their true weapon was their knowledge of the land and their unwavering resolve. The hunt was a slow, patient, and deadly business. Let us follow one such hunt to understand the nature of this final war. In the forested foothills of the newly risen mountains, an Aes Sedai named Lyra and her two companions, a grim bearded man named Kyle and his sharp-eyed daughter, Brina, were on the trail of a channeler known only as the Carver. His madness was artistic. He did not destroy. He reshaped. He would find a stand of ancient giant trees and, over the course of a few days, weave the One Power to twist and carve them into monstrous, screaming figures. He would find a herd of wild animals and fuse them together into writhing, multi-limbed abominations that would die in agony over the course of weeks. His work was a gallery of horror, and his path was marked by these gruesome sculptures of flesh and wood. Lyra, Kale, and Brina had been tracking him for 2 months. They had followed his trail of terror through deserted villages and blighted valleys. Lyra, with her ability to sense the lingering resonance of Sidin, could feel when they were getting close. It felt like a faint, sour vibration in the air, a wrongness that made the teeth ache. Kyle and Brina, with their practical skills, found the physical tracks, the signs of his passage that were invisible to any but the most experienced woodsman. They found him in a small, secluded meadow. He was an old man, thin and frail, with a long white beard that reached his waist. He was standing before a massive stone outcropping, his hands moving in the air as if conducting an invisible orchestra. The stone was slowly, visibly changing shape, twisting into the form of a gigantic, agonized human face. The sound of grinding rock filled the air. He was so absorbed in his work that he did not notice their approach. The plan was simple, and they had rehearsed it a dozen times. Kyle and Brina would be the distraction. Lyra would be the weapon. The two warriors split up, circling the meadow from opposite sides. On Lyra's signal, they broke from the trees, screaming war cries, charging at the old man with their spears. The Carver turned, his eyes wide, not with fear, but with annoyance, like an artist interrupted in a moment of inspiration. He sneered, and with a lazy flick of his wrist, the ground in front of Kale erupted, throwing him backwards. A wave of force, invisible but solid, slammed into Brina, sending her tumbling through the air. But they had done their job. For a crucial few seconds, the Carver's attention was divided. In that moment, Lyra acted. She had been holding a weave of Saidar, a complex net of spirit and air, pure and clean and sharp as a razor. She released it, not at the man, but at his connection to the One Power. It was a delicate, surgical strike, the culmination of a century of hard-won knowledge. The man screamed, a sound of pure, soul-shattering agony. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head. The grinding of the rock stopped. The air, which had been thick with the oppressive feel of his power, suddenly felt clean. Lyra's weave had found its mark. She had severed him from the source. This was the act of gentling. It was not an act of mercy. The man, the Carver, was still alive, but his world had ended. For a male channeler, the One Power was more than a tool. It was a sense, a constant presence, the feeling of a raging river of life flowing through them. To have that connection suddenly and violently cut was to be rendered deaf, blind, and numb all at once. It left a void, a hollow emptiness that the mind could not endure. The Carver looked up at them, his eyes no longer filled with mad inspiration, but with a profound and utter blankness. A thin line of drool trickled from his mouth. He would live out the rest of his days like this, a harmless, empty shell, his mind shattered beyond any hope of repair. Kyle and Brina got to their feet, bruised but alive. They looked at the broken man on the ground, and then at Lyra. There was no triumph in their eyes, only a weary sadness. This was a victory, but it felt like a funeral. They had removed one more monster from the world, but they had also destroyed a man. Not all hunts ended this way. Sometimes the only option was death. The female Aes Sedai were almost always outmatched in terms of raw power. The male channelers, fueled by the taint, could wield a brute force that was difficult to counter. In these cases, the hunt was a matter of assassination. The warrior companions would have to get close enough to use a spear or an arrow, while the Aes Sedai used her power to create a momentary shield or a diversion. Many of these missions failed. For every successful hunt, there was a story of an Aes Sedai and her companions who were simply overwhelmed, their bodies left as another gruesome landmark in a wanderer's territory. The process was brutally slow. For every channeler they gentled or killed, another might remain hidden for a decade. But year by year, the number of wanderers dwindled. 10 became 9. 9 became 5. 5 became 3. The world grew quieter. The stories of new atrocities became less frequent. For the first time in nearly 3 centuries, a fragile, tentative sense of safety began to take root in the most isolated corners of the world. People began to rebuild in a more permanent way, laying the foundations of the first new towns, planting the first real crops. They were still living in a world of ruins, but the age of active, constant destruction was finally, truly, coming to an end. One figure, however, remained. He was the first and the last, the most powerful and the most feared. He was Lews Therin Telamon, the dragon. For nearly 300 years he had wandered the earth, a force of nature unlike any other. He was a myth, even to the people who were themselves myths. The other wanderers were localized disasters, Lews. Therin was a global catastrophe. His grief and his madness were so profound, his power so immense, that his mere presence warped reality around him. Where he walked, the seasons would change in an instant, summer turning to winter and back again in the space of a day. The sky above him was a permanent storm of black clouds and baleful lightning. He did not speak. He did not create or destroy with any conscious purpose. He was simply a vortex of raw, untamed power, a wound in the pattern that would not heal. The female Aes Sedai did not hunt him. They knew it was a hopeless task. No single Aes Sedai, nor even a dozen of them, could hope to stand against the power of the dragon, even a dragon driven mad by the taint. They could only track his movements, charting his destructive path across the world and warning people to flee from his approach. He was the kinslayer, the man who had murdered his own family in the first days of the madness. And that name was a curse whispered in every corner of the world. He was the living symbol of the breaking, the ultimate embodiment of their sour victory. He had no memory of who he was. His mind was a storm of disconnected images, of rage without an object and sorrow without a source. He was trapped in a perpetual nightmare, his only reality the tainted torrent of Sadin that was both his sustenance and his poison. He saw the world through a thick, greasy filter of paranoia and despair. A beautiful mountain was a threatening spike aimed at the heavens. A calm sea was a pit waiting to swallow him. The faces of the few humans he encountered were twisted masks of shadow spawn, and he would lash out with unthinking, devastating force, obliterating them and the land they stood on before he had even processed the thought. For 3 centuries, this was his existence. Then one day, something changed. He was walking through a desolate, rocky plain, a landscape he himself had scoured of all life decades before. The sky above was its usual turmoil of black and purple. The ground trembled with his every step. He was, as always, lost in the howling chaos of his own mind. He passed a single withered tree, the last survivor of a forest he had turned to ash. Caught in its dead branches was a small object, a child's doll, its cloth body faded and torn, its button eyes staring blankly. He stopped. He did not know why. He looked at the doll, and for the first time in centuries, a flicker of something other than madness stirred in his mind. It was a faint, distant echo, a ghost of a thought. The doll. It reminded him of something. And then, the dam broke. It was not a gradual awakening. It was a cataclysmic, instantaneous event, a flash of lightning in the deepest part of his soul. In a single horrific moment, the madness receded. The storm in his mind fell silent. The greasy filter of the taint was burned away by a sudden, impossible burst of pure, unadulterated memory. He remembered. He remembered everything. The first image that flooded his mind was of a woman's face. Ilyena, his wife. He remembered the exact shade of her eyes, the sound of her laughter, the scent of her hair. The memory was so vivid, so real, that it was physically painful. It was followed by the faces of his children, a cascade of images of them playing in the sunlit gardens of his home, their small hands in his. The love he felt for them was not a distant echo. It was a living, breathing thing that filled his chest with a pressure so immense he could not breathe. He remembered his friends, the faces of the 100 companions, proud and strong as they stood with him at Shayol Ghul. He remembered the feeling of pure, untainted Saidin, the clean, exhilarating rush of life and power. He remembered the hope, the relief, the triumph of that final moment when the bore was sealed. And then he remembered what came next. The horror descended upon him, not as a nightmare, but as a cold, clear, factual memory. He saw through his own eyes, his hands weaving the one power. He saw his beautiful home, and he saw himself setting it aflame. He heard the screams of his children, and he knew that he was the one causing their pain. He saw Ilyena's face, not smiling, but twisted in terror and disbelief, and he remembered striking the final blow. The memory did not stop there. It flooded him with the accumulated horror of 300 years. He saw the cities he had leveled, the mountains he had broken, the millions of lives he had extinguished in his unthinking, insane rage. Every act of destruction, every moment of madness, every terrified face that had looked upon him before being annihilated. It all came rushing back, not as a story, but as a personal experience. He was not just the dragon, the savior. He was the kinslayer. He was the destroyer of worlds. The silence in his mind was replaced by a single, deafening scream of his own soul. The grief that struck him was a force more powerful than any weave of the one power. It was a physical entity, a black hole of sorrow that threatened to collapse his very being. He fell to his knees, his body convulsing, not from madness, but from a sanity that was 1,000 times more painful. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had once held his children, and saw them stained with the blood of the entire world. He could feel the madness, the familiar comfort of the taint's rage and paranoia, trying to reclaim him, trying to pull him back into its merciful oblivion. But he would not let it. He could not bear to lose himself again, to become that monster. He had to end it. He rose to his feet, a single, terrible purpose in his clear, sane eyes. He needed to die. But a death for him could not be a simple thing. He could not allow his body to be found, to be revered or desecrated. And he could not risk the madness taking him again in his final moments. His death had to be absolute. He reached for the one power, for Saidin. He opened himself to it, and the familiar filth washed over him. But this time, he did not just sip from the river. He opened a floodgate. He drew on a quantity of the one power that no channeler had ever dared to touch, an amount that the human body was never meant to contain. He pulled and pulled, drawing a torrent of power so vast that it was like trying to channel an entire ocean through a garden hose. The sheer volume of the power was so immense that it had a purifying effect. It was like a flash flood scouring a dirty riverbed. For one last glorious moment, the taint was burned away by the pure, white-hot energy. The power flowing through him was clean. It was the Saidin he remembered from his youth, the power of life and creation. He was, for the last second of his life, whole again. He stood in the desolate plain, his body glowing with a light so brilliant It was like a new sun had been born on the earth. The sky above him roiled, the very fabric of the pattern groaning under the strain of such a concentration of power. He focused all of it, every last drop of his life force, his grief, his power, and his soul, not outwards at the world, but inwards, upon himself. He did not scream. His final act was one of silent, perfect release. The world exploded. The resulting blast was not one of fire and force, but of pure creation. The land where Lews Therin stood was thrust violently upwards. Bedrock melted, the crust of the earth buckling as a new mountain was born in a single fiery instant. It rose miles into the sky, a perfect symmetrical cone of black, volcanic rock. A plume of ash and smoke blotted out the sun across the continent. The sound of its creation was a single titanic clap of thunder that was heard from the spine of the world to the shores of the Arith Ocean. It was the world's funeral drum, a final, percussive end to the age of madness. When the dust settled, Lews Therin Telamon was gone. He had been utterly consumed, his body and soul becoming the substance of the great mountain. In his place stood a towering, smoking volcano, a permanent scar and a monument. It would forever be known as Dragon Mount, the dragon's grave, and his final, terrible creation. The breaking of the world was not over, but its heart had just stopped beating. The final roar had sounded, and now a great and terrible silence was about to fall upon the world. Epilogue. The silence after the fury. The creation of Dragon Mount was the world's last great scream. After the final roar, a silence fell. It was a silence unlike any that had come before. It was not the quiet of a peaceful evening, nor the hushed stillness of a snowy morning. It was a profound, deafening emptiness. The sound of a great engine that had been running for 300 years, finally sputtering to a halt. The constant, low-level thrum of the earth's torment ceased. The perpetual, unnatural storms that had plagued the skies for generations finally broke, their winds dying down to mere whispers. For the first time in 10 generations, the world was still. Survivors, huddled in their caves in their fortified ruins, in the deep, peaceful sanctuaries of the Ogier steading, felt the change. It was a sensation so alien that it was, at first, terrifying. The absence of the constant, low-grade fear they had lived with their entire lives was a void. A child born in the final year of the breaking, who had known nothing but the trembling earth, might wake in the middle of the night and cry, frightened by the unfamiliar sensation of solid, unmoving ground beneath them. People emerged from their shelters, blinking in a sunlight that seemed unnaturally bright and clear, the centuries of dust and ash having finally begun to settle from the atmosphere. They looked at a sky that was, for the first time, simply blue. They emerged into a new world. It was a broken, scarred, and utterly alien landscape. The geography of their ancestors was a forgotten dream. In its place were the titanic monuments to the madness that had just ended. The spine of the world, a jagged knife edge of mountains, now divided the continent, an impassable barrier of stone and ice. The Arith Ocean washed against shores that had once been hundreds of miles inland. The great Ale Waste shimmered under the newly cleared sun, a sea of sand where fertile plains had once stood. And on the horizon, a new and terrible peak smoked gently, a perfect cone of black rock that had not been there the day before. Dragon Mount. These were not just geographical features, they were gravestones. They were the physical record of the world's long and terrible sickness. Humanity was shattered. The population was a tiny, fragile remnant of what it had been. They were scattered across the vast continent in small, isolated pockets, with no knowledge of or contact with one another. They were a people stripped of their history, their technology, and their culture. The Age of Legends was now well and truly a myth. A garbled collection of stories about an impossible golden age, a time before the rage of the Earthshakers and the Skyburners. The survivors were hard, practical, and deeply superstitious. They were the seeds of a new age, planted in the soil of an old one's grave. The few remaining female Aes Sedai, who had been the hunters and guardians of the final century, now faced a new and daunting task. Their war was over. The last of the madmen were dead or gentled. Now, they were the sole inheritors of a shattered legacy. They possessed the last fragments of the old knowledge, the last memory of a structured, civilized world. Their purpose shifted from one of destruction to one of preservation and eventually of rebuilding. They began the long, slow process of gathering the scattered survivors, of teaching, of trying to rekindle the faint embers of civilization. It would be a task that would take centuries, a task that would lead to the founding of new nations, the creation of the White Tower, and the beginning of a new turning of the wheel. But that was a story for another time. In the immediate aftermath of the breaking, there was no sense of hope. There was no victory. There was only exhaustion. A deep, soul-profound weariness that settled over the land and its people. They had survived. That was all. They stood amidst the magnificent, incomprehensible ruins of their ancestors' world, like children lost in the graveyard of gods. The silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of the tomb. The fever had broken, but the patient was left weak, scarred, and with no memory of who they had once been. The breaking of the world was over. The long, slow, and arduous task of finding a way to live in its wreckage had just begun. The Third Age, an age of iron and shadow, of forgotten prophecies, and the slow turning of the great wheel, had dawned not with a sunrise, but with the quiet grey light of a world waking from an endless nightmare.